The emergency alarms screamed through the bridge of the human warship. Determination, as Commander Park Min-ho watched his home planet burn below. Kepler 44, to be had been humanity's pride just hours ago. Now, it looked like a dying ember in space, covered in strange orange fires that spread across its surface like a disease. "Sir, we're getting the last messages from Colony Base 7, said Lieutenant Kim Sora. Her voice shook as she spoke. The young woman had family down there. They all did. This wasn't just any planet. This was home to over 50,000 humans who had built new lives among the stars. Min-ho gripped the metal rail in front of him as another evacuation ship exploded outside the main window. The enemy interceptor ships moved like deadly insects through space. The Vrak looked like giant bugs with wet, shiny shells that reflected the light from the burning planet. They had come from nowhere, arriving in massive living ships that looked more grown than built. "How many people made it off the planet?" Min-ho asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. 12,000 civilians got away, sir. But we think 50,000 are still down there." Sora's hands trembled as she worked at her control panel. The defense stations at New Busan just went silent. The Vrak are moving through the neighborhoods now. Through the tactical screen, Min-ho watched the final defense platforms stop working. The beautiful city of New Busan, with its tall towers and green parks where his own children had played, was now feeding ground for the alien swarm. He had visited there just last month for his daughter's birthday. Now it was gone. The Vrak were unlike any enemy humanity had faced before. They didn't use metal ships or energy weapons like other species. Instead, they flew in vessels that looked alive, with surfaces that pulsed like beating hearts. Their weapons shot acid that could melt through the strongest human armor, moved in perfect coordination, like parts of a single organism. "Min-ho, we need to leave now," came the voice of Captain Lee Dong-wook from the escort ship Resilience. "Long-range sensors show 3 more Vrak bioships coming this way. Big ones." The weight of command felt like a heavy stone in Min-ho's chest. Every part of him wanted to stay and fight, to die alongside his people if necessary. But he had 13 ships under his command, and 20,000 refugees aboard them. These were people who had escaped the nightmare below. They were counting on him to get them to safety. Below on the planet, the Vrak were doing something horrible. They weren't just conquering, they were changing everything. Air itself was turning poisonous as their ships pumped strange chemicals into the atmosphere. The forests were dying, turning black and twisted. Even the oceans were changing color, becoming a sickly green that hurt to look at. The human ground forces had fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed in hours. The Vrak warriors were 8 feet tall, with sharp claws and armor that seemed to be part of their bodies. They moved faster than humans and seemed to feel no pain. Worse, they worked together perfectly, like they shared a single mind. "All ships prepare for hyperspace jump," Min-ho ordered. His voice stayed steady even though his heart was breaking. "We're falling back to Earth." As he gave the order, he could see evacuation shuttles still trying to escape the planet's surface. Some made it to the waiting ships. Others were torn apart by Vrak interceptors, their debris falling back toward the dying world like metal rain. The jump to hyperspace was always disorienting. The stars stretched into long lines of light, and the burning planet disappeared behind them. But Min-ho knew he would never forget the sight of his homeworld dying. The orange fires spreading across continents. The strange, organic towers that the Vrak were already building, where human cities used to stand. In the refugee ships, families mourned for loved ones left behind. Children asked why they couldn't go home. Adults stared at nothing, trying to process the loss of everything they had built over decades of hard work. The colony on Kepler 44 to be had been humanity's success story, a world where they had truly made a new life among the stars. Now it belonged to the Vrak, who would use it to breed more of their kind. Intelligence reports suggested that was how they operated. They would consume a world's resources and turn it into a nursery for billions of new warriors. Then they would spread to the next system, and the next. As the fleet traveled through hyperspace toward Earth, Min-ho made a promise to himself and to the people who had died. This wasn't over. Humanity didn't abandon its own. They would find a way to return, no matter how impossible it seemed. might have won this battle. But they had also made an enemy that would never stop fighting. The ground was lost, but the war was just beginning. And Minho intended to make sure that when humans returned to Kepler-4 for 2B, they would bring with them something the Vrak had never seen before: the fury of a species that refused to give up on its own people. 3 months had passed since the fall of Kepler-4 to B, and the war room aboard Earth's orbital command station felt heavy with tension. Admiral Yoon Tae-young stood before a massive holographic display showing the lost planet, now transformed into something that barely looked like the world humans had once called home. "The Vrak have turned the entire planet into a breeding ground," announced Major Han the-jin, pointing at the swirling image before them. Her face bore scars from her own escape from the planet, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Our spy drones show huge organic structures where our cities used to be. We estimate over 10 billion Vrak are now living there." Commander Park Min-ho stepped closer to the display. The man who had been forced to abandon his homeworld looked older now, his hair showing gray that hadn't been there before. "What about survivors? Are there any of our people still alive down there?" The Jin's expression softened slightly. "Deep scan probes detected human life signs in the old underground tunnel systems. About 15,000 people are still alive, spread across 12 different locations." She paused, then added quietly, "But they won't last much longer. The Vrak are pumping poison gases into the air. The tunnel seals are starting to fail." Admiral Yoon studied the thick, toxic clouds that now covered the planet like a diseased blanket. The atmosphere had become so poisoned that it glowed with an unnatural orange light. "Any normal attack is impossible. Our fighter ships can't fly through that poison, and the Vrak have filled the clouds with flying hunters." "There might be another way," said General Bae Soo-jin, commander of the Marine Forces. The tough woman had lost her left arm in the Centauri War, and her mechanical replacement clicked softly as she moved the holographic image. "We could drop straight down through the clouds." Orbital insertion pods launched from high above the atmosphere. The room became quiet. Everyone knew what she was suggesting was almost certainly suicide. Captain Kim Woo-han, the youngest ship, commander in the fleet, spoke what everyone was thinking. "General, with respect, that's a death mission. Those drop pods have never been tested in real combat. We'd be going in blind against impossible odds." Soo-jin's eyes held the fire that had earned her the nickname Iron Phoenix during years of fighting. She had never lost a battle, and she had never left soldiers behind. Since when do Marines worry about impossible odds? "Those are our people down there, our families. We don't abandon our own." The drop pods she was talking about were experimental. They were designed to punch through any atmosphere and land troops anywhere on a planet. But they had only been tested in safe conditions. No one knew if they would work in the poisonous hell that Kepler-4 had become. Minho looked at the tactical display showing the planet's surface. Where New Busan had once stood, there was now a massive organic structure that pulsed with veins of light. It looked more like a giant heart than a building. The parks where children had played were now covered in what looked like enormous eggs. The beaches where families had walked were now breeding pools for alien creatures. "The Vrak atmospheric processors are the real problem," the Jin explained, manipulating the display to show the alien machinery. "They're massive biomechanical devices that are changing the very air itself. They're not just making it poisonous, they're making it alive. The clouds themselves are full of Vrak organisms." Admiral Yoon nodded slowly. He had fought in 3 wars and had never seen an enemy like this. The Vrak didn't just conquer worlds, they digested them, turning them into extensions of their own biology. "How many Marines can you give me, General?" 1,000 of the best we have. Every single one will volunteer." "They know what this means." Soo-jin's voice was steady, but everyone could hear the emotion beneath it. She was asking 2,000 men and women to almost certainly die. The plan was insane in its simplicity. 12 ships would approach Kepler-4 for it to be at maximum speed. At exactly 50,000 feet above the surface, they would launch 2,000 drop pods simultaneously. Each pod would carry 1 Marine in advanced combat armor, along with enough supplies for a 3-day mission. The Marines would punch through the toxic cloud layer, land on the hostile surface, fight their way to the survivor locations, and somehow get 15,000 civilians to extraction points where rescue shuttles could pick them up. All of this while fighting billions of alien creatures on their home ground. The drop will be the most dangerous part, Sujin explained. Once we hit those clouds, we'll be flying blind. The Vrak hunters will be waiting for us. Many pods won't make it to the ground. Captain Wu Haiyan studied the numbers on his tablet. Even if half the Marines make it down alive, they'll be outnumbered 1,000,000 to 1. Then we'd better make sure every shot counts. Sujin replied with a grim smile as the planning session continued through the night. Minho stared at the image of his dying homeworld. Soon he would return to keep the promise he had made. Ground had been lost, but they were going back to reclaim it, one drop pod at a time. The drop bay of the human warship Retribution buzzed with nervous energy as 2,000 Marines made their final preparations. Sergeant O.J. Soon checked his squad's equipment one last time, his weathered face showing none of the fear that twisted in his stomach like a cold snake. "Listen up," he told his team, looking each of them in the eye. "These drop pods have never been used in real combat before. Once we hit the atmosphere, everything is going to go wrong fast." His squad gathered around him, Corporal Na Haiwan, barely 20 years old, but deadly accurate with her plasma rifle. Private Song Kite, a farm boy from the outer colonies who had joined the Marines to see the galaxy, and 6 others who had become his family over 3 years of fighting together. The drop pods looked like metal coffins lined up in neat rows. Each one was just big enough for a single Marine in their gear. Inside, glowing screens showed tactical information, but everyone knew that once they hit the poisonous clouds below, those screens would probably go dark. 30 seconds to launch. The announcement echoed through the bay, and Jae-sung felt his heart start beating faster. He sealed his helmet and climbed into his drop pod. The cramped space barely large enough for his armored body. Around him, 2,000 other Marines were doing the same thing, each one knowing they might not survive the next hour. The pod's interior smelled like metal and fierce sweat. "All units, this is Admiral Yoon," the voice came through their helmet speakers. "You are the best humanity has to offer. Bring our people home." The launch felt like being shot from a cannon. Jae-sung's pod rocketed away from the ship, along with hundreds of others, forming a stream of metal teardrops falling toward the nightmare world below. For the first few minutes, it was just like training a standard drop through the upper atmosphere, where the air was still clean. Then they hit the clouds. The pod shook violently as something huge scraped along its outer hull. Through his small window, Jae-sung caught a glimpse of writhing tentacles covered in glowing spots, one of the aerial hunters that lived in the poisonous atmosphere. The creature was the size of a shuttle and moved through the toxic air like a shark through water. Contact. Haiwan's voice screamed over the radio. Before cutting to static, Jae-sung watched in horror as the pod next to his exploded in a shower of acid and twisted metal. One of the aerial hunters had grabbed it with its tentacles and crushed it like an egg. He could see the Marine inside through the cracked window for just a moment before the pod spun away into the orange glowing clouds. Warning lights flashed red across his control panel as the toxic atmosphere began eating through his pod's outer shell. The poison was so strong it could melt metal, and it was slowly working its way toward him. Systems failing. Kite's panicked voice barely made it through the interference. "My heat shields are gone. The acid is getting through." The clouds around them seemed alive, full of rat creatures that made the simple act of falling toward the planet into a battle for survival. Jae-sung could see other pods being attacked by flying things that looked like jellyfish made of acid. Some Marines were fighting back with their pod's emergency weapons, sending streams of plasma fire into the toxic mist. Of the 2,000 Marines who had launched from the ships above, Jae-sung could only count about 300 pod signals still working on his tactical display. The rest had either been destroyed or their communication systems had failed. Below them, the surface of Kepler-4 for 2b came into view through breaks in the toxic clouds. What Jae-sung saw made his blood run cold. The planet looked like it was infected with some terrible disease. Organic towers twisted up toward the sky like giant fingers, their surfaces covered in veins that pulsed with sickly light. Where human cities had once stood, there There were now structures that looked more grown than built. The old Central Park, where he had taken his children to feed the ducks during their last visit, was now a field of enormous sacks that glowed from within. Each one was the size of a building, and he could see dark shapes moving inside them. New. Brack being born to replace the ones that had conquered his world, his pod's altimeter showed 5,000 feet and dropping fast. The automatic systems were trying to slow his descent, but the toxic atmosphere was interfering with everything. He could feel the heat building up as his pod cut through the poisonous air like a meteor. Brace for impact, he called to his squad. Though he wasn't sure anyone could hear him through the interference, as his pod screamed toward the nightmare landscape below, Jay soon gripped his plasma rifle and checked his armor's life support systems one more time. The easy part was over. Now came the real test, fighting an entire planet's worth of alien monsters to save 15,000 people who were counting on them. The ground rushed up to meet him, and Sergeant O'Jay's own prepared to keep the promise every Marine had made, to bring their people home, no matter what hell they had to walk through to do it. The impact knocked the breath from Sergeant O.J. Sung's lungs and made his teeth bite into his tongue until he tasted blood. His drop pod had crashed into what the maps called Central Park in old New Busan, but now it was something from a nightmare. Enormous sacks the size of houses pulsed with sick yellow light, and he could see dark shapes moving inside them, like babies waiting to be born. Squad report. "Ah!" he shouted, kicking open his pod's damaged door. The metal screamed as it bent, and poisonous air immediately began seeping into his suit. His armor's filters worked overtime to keep the toxic atmosphere from killing him. "Hi, one here, I'm alive," came the voice of his young corporal. She sounded shaken but ready to fight. "Kite?" Reporting. "My pod is completely broken, but I can still move." Only 5 of his 8 Marines answered. The others were gone, either killed in the drop or consumed by the creatures that hunted in this poisonous hell. Jason felt each loss like a knife in his chest, but there was no time to mourn. The landscape around them defied description. Twisted towers of what looked like bone and flesh reached toward the toxic sky, their surfaces covered in veins that carried glowing fluid like alien blood. The air itself seemed alive, thick with floating spores that made strange patterns in the orange light. Everything pulsed with a rhythm like a massive heartbeat, where the shopping district had once been. Organic tunnels now twisted through the air, like the intestines of some giant beast. The fountain where children had played was now a pool of bubbling acid that gave off steam that hurt to look at. The trees in the park had been replaced by things that looked like giant mushrooms covered in eyes. Movement at 2 o'clock. Haiwan's plasma rifle whined as it charged up, then sent bolts of blue energy into a group of approaching Vrak warriors. The alien creatures were 8 feet tall, with bodies that looked like armored insects walking on 2 legs. Their claws could cut through steel, and their shells could stop most human weapons, but not plasma rifles. The molecular disruption weapons tore through the aliens like they were made of paper, dissolving their bodies at the atomic level. For a moment, Jae-soon felt hope. Then 10 more Vrak warriors crawled out of holes in the ground, followed by 20 more, then 50. They kept coming like ants from a disturbed nest, their compound eyes reflecting the poisonous light as they moved with perfect coordination toward the humans. "This is Captain Choi Min-sik, Bravo Company," a voice crackled over the radio through. "Heavy static. We found survivors, 200 civilians in the old subway tunnels at Sector 7. We're taking heavy losses. Need help now." Jae-soon checked his tactical display, though half the screen was cracked from the impact. Sector 7 was 3 kilometers away through what had once been the financial district. Now it was a maze of alien structures that looked like they had been grown rather than built. Every building pulsed with veins of light, and strange sounds echoed from inside them. "Copy that, Captain. We're coming." He turned to his surviving Marines. "You heard him? We have people to save." They moved through the twisted streets, their powered armor servos whining under the strain of the hostile environment. Every step was a battle. Vrak warriors burst from the ground without warning, their claws scraping against human armor. Flying creatures the size of cars dove from the poisonous clouds above, spraying acid that could melt through metal. The very ground seemed to fight against them. What looked like normal pavement would suddenly become soft and try to trap their feet. Walls would grow spikes when they got too close. The alien infection had spread through everything, turning the entire city into a living weapon, Kite screamed. As something like a giant worm with too many teeth erupted from a storm drain and wrapped around his leg. High One's plasma fire cut the creature in half, but not before its acid blood ate through Kite's armor and into the flesh beneath. I can still fight, the young Marine insisted, though Jae-soon could see the pain in his eyes. They pressed on through streets that no longer looked anything like the city Jae-soon remembered. The bank where he had gotten his first loan was now a throbbing mass of flesh with dozens of eyes. The school where his daughter had learned to read was covered in what looked like a spider web made of nerves that sparked with electricity. Above them, the toxic clouds churned with alien life. Creatures that looked like flying jellyfish drifted between organic towers, while things that might have been birds if birds were made of acid and hatred circled overhead. There, High One pointed ahead with her rifle. I can see the subway entrance. Entrance to the old subway system was half blocked by alien growth, but there was still a gap large enough for humans to squeeze through. From inside came the faint sound of human voices, survivors who had been hiding in the dark for 3 months, waiting for rescue that they probably thought would never come. Jae-sung looked at his ammunition counter, it's half empty already, and they had barely begun the real fight. The old subway tunnels beneath New Busan had become humanity's final refuge on the dying planet. Captain Choi Min-sik led the combined marine force through passages that dripped with moisture from the poisonous atmosphere above. The concrete walls were cracked and stained, but they had held back the toxic air for 3 months. Behind the Marines, 15,000 survivors followed in a desperate march toward freedom. These were the people who had refused to give up. Families who had hidden in the deepest parts of the underground system while alien monsters transformed their world. Above, children who had learned to whisper so the creatures wouldn't hear them. Old people who had shared their medicine so everyone could survive just one more day. Sir, my power is almost gone, reported Corporal Nahaiwan. Her plasma rifle's energy display showed only red warning lights. Around them, the tunnel walls shook as massive alien queens dug through the earth above their heads. The psychic screams of these enormous creatures made some Marines fall to their knees, all clutching their helmets as the alien thoughts tried to invade their minds. Sergeant Oh Jae-sung held the rear of the group, his armor scarred by acid burns and claw marks from the running battle through the city. A small girl, maybe 6 years old, looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much horror for someone so young. Are we really going home now? She asked in a tiny voice. Jae-sung knelt down to her level, his damaged helmet reflecting her frightened face. Yes, little one, we're all going home today. Extraction point was just ahead, a natural cave where the rescue shuttles could land. But between them and safety waited the largest group of Vrak they had seen yet. Thousands of the alien warriors filled the tunnel, their insect bodies gleaming in the emergency lighting. Behind them came larger creatures, the size of tanks, with claws that could tear through concrete. All units, this is Admiral Yoon. The voice came through heavy static over their radios. The shuttles are coming down now. You need to hold your position for 10 more minutes. 10 minutes felt like 10 hours when facing an alien army. The Marines formed a defensive line across the tunnel, their weapons creating a wall of plasma fire that lit up the darkness. The first wave of Vrak warriors died in the energy blasts, their bodies dissolving into nothing. But more kept coming, climbing over the remains of their dead without hesitation. The first rescue shuttle broke through the toxic clouds above, its shields glowing white-hot as it fought against the poisonous atmosphere. The pilot brought it down in the cavern with skill that took Jae-sung's breath away. Immediately, civilians began running toward it, mothers carrying babies, fathers helping elderly grandparents, teenagers supporting injured friends. Load them. Up fast, Min-sik shouted over the noise of battle. We can't hold this position much longer. One by one, the shuttles descended through the toxic hell above. Each one carried away 200 people, families who would see Earth again. Children who would grow up under clean skies, old people who would die in peace instead of in alien nightmares. But the cost was terrible. Marine after Marine fell as the Vrak pressed their attack. Private Song Kate, the farm boy who had joined to see the galaxy, died holding a tunnel entrance so a group of children could escape. His last words over the radio were, "Tell my mom I kept my promise." Jae-sung's powered armor finally gave up. Its energy cells completely drained. He fell back to his sidearm, a simple projectile weapon that seemed pathetically weak against the alien horde. But he kept firing, kept fighting as the last children were loaded onto the final shuttle. "Sergeant, you need to get on that shuttle now," Captain Mincy yelled over the chaos of battle. "Someone has to cover the retreat," Jae-sung replied, ejecting his empty magazine and loading his last clip. The tunnel was collapsing now as the alien Gweens broke through from above. Chunks of concrete fell like rain, and the emergency lights flickered and died one by one. In the growing darkness, the only light came from plasma rifle bursts and the glowing eyes of alien creatures, as the last shuttle lifted off with the final group of civilians. Jasun found himself alone in the tunnel, surrounded by advancing Vrak warriors. His weapon was empty, his armor was dead, and he was outnumbered 1,000 to 1. But then, cutting through the chaos, came a sound that made his heart leap, the whine of shuttle engines returning. The rescue ships dove back through the toxic atmosphere, their weapons blazing as they carved a path through the alien swarm. Emergency cables dropped from their hulls, and the surviving Marines clipped on just as the entire tunnel system began to collapse as the shuttles climbed toward the waiting fleet in orbit. Jasun looked down at the nightmare world that had once been his home. They had lost the ground, but they had saved their people. 15,000 human lives were now safe aboard the evacuation ships. The human fleet jumped to hyperspace, leaving the poisoned world behind. Of the 2,000 Marines who had dropped through the clouds, fewer than 300 had survived. But every single civilian had been rescued. Sometimes that was what victory looked like.